as the result of the death of Alexander the Great, his generals took over with their armies the various parts of the empire, and one empire called the Antigonid. Antigonus was one of his generals. That empire, actually that kingdom, embodied Greece and the adjoining areas, so it was the European part of his empire, which doesn't concern us because the Jews were not involved in that. The two empires that had a great effect on the Jews at the time were the Ptolemaic Empire, and that incorporated Egypt and Israel, and the Seleucid Empire, which was Western Asia. And essentially, the Seleucid Empire was Syria, Iraq, which was Babylonia, of course, and Iran, and some areas adjacent to it. Now, the Jews were now divided between two political entities. The Jews of Babylonia, which was the large Jewish community in Western Asia, were in the Seleucid Empire. The Jews of Israel were in the Ptolemaic Empire. And the Ptolemaic Empire began to develop and built the city of Alexandria, Egypt, as its capital. And the emperors, Ptolemy I and his son and successor, Ptolemy II, they dedicated themselves to making Alexandria the greatest Greek city in the world. And by the way, they succeeded. Alexandria, Egypt became a vast metropolis of Greek civilization and developed in many areas, artistic, scientific, and in many other areas that you can imagine. It became the great center of Greek civilization. What happened in Alexandria is interesting, and it gives us an indication of the transformations that took place in Jewish life as a result of the Alexandrian conquests and the establishment of these empires. Alexandria grew phenomenally from the time of its foundation. The story is Alexander came there, looked at this fishing village on the western branch of the Nile, and told his architects to plan a city there that became Alexandria. Now, 75 years later, the city had become one of the largest cities in the world. We don't know the exact figures, but it had hundreds of thousands population, perhaps close to 1 million, around the year 250 BC, when it was the great metropolis of the Greek world. The other interesting phenomenon is that in that population of Alexandria, a very large proportion were Jews. There may have been 25% of the population were Jewish. The other thing is that in 250 BC, most of the Jews of Alexandria were Greek-speaking, and very few of them were Hebrew-speaking. So there was a very large and rapid acculturation of the Jews. And this happened in other Greek cities, probably in Antioch, in Syria as well. But it's very clear that the Jews of Alexandria in 250 BC were Greek-speaking, they were acculturated. One thing we have to understand also is that the Jewish population of Alexandria had its own, what they called a national assembly. And the Greeks had their own national assembly. And later on, during the reign of the Emperor Claudius of Rome, in his letter to Alexandria, he makes it very clear that Alexandria is a Greek city and that the Jews of Alexandria have full rights to live in Alexandria, but it's clear that they're not citizens of the city. So there is a difference in their national identification. As he mentions in his letter, he says, the Jews of Alexandria have rights in the city which has been accorded to them by emperors in the past, and these rights are not to be curtailed. So he says the Jews of Alexandria have their rights, they should live there. The Greeks are the citizens of the city, and then he warns them not to start any trouble, because there had been trouble, which is what called for his restriction on the city. Now, between Alexandria and Jerusalem, a very close relationship had developed. You see, Israel was a part of the empire. In Israel, there was a flourishing Jewish population, which had increased, by the way, because the two great capitals were now situated at opposite ends of the country. Since Seleucus had decided to make his capital in northern Syria and Alexandria in Egypt, and Israel is between them, and all the lines of communication and the lines of commercial activity were just flowing from northern Syria through Israel to Egypt and back, Israel became rather prosperous and its population increased. And Jews, by the way, when I ask the question, how did it happen that Alexandria in Egypt, from the year 328, let's say, until the year 250, not a long period of time, from zero had become such a great city, and from zero Jewish population suddenly had several 100,000 Jews? There must have been a migration. And the large Jewish population was Babylonia. And evidently, when we just look at the historical picture, Seleucus had established his capital on the Mediterranean coast of his empire. He had moved or drawn the commercial and cultural center from Babylon to the west. So the boom towns were the great Greek cities on the shores of the Mediterranean. And since these were the cities that were growing, population followed. And I imagine that there was a significant Jewish migration from Babylonia into Antioch and then through the land of Israel to Alexandria, Egypt. Now, since Israel was a part of the Ptolemaic Empire, relations between the Ptolemies and the Jews of Israel were cordial. The figurehead, that is, the person who was most prominent in the land of Israel, was the high priest in Jerusalem. I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, but when the Persian Empire had conquered and had absorbed the entire Babylonian Empire, including the land of Israel, and the emperor of Persia, Cyrus the Great, said he wants the temple to be rebuilt and he wants Jerusalem to be rebuilt, he made it very clear that he wanted Jerusalem to be the religious center of the Jewish people, but he didn't want the king of the Jews to live in Jerusalem. You can understand that. So he actually had the king of the Jews living in his palace in Babylonia, where he could keep an eye on him. But Israel was to be the land of the Jewish people, and the major institution would be the temple, and that's the way it remained for several centuries. So the high priest of Jerusalem was the leading figure in the land of Israel, and there were cordial relations between him and his emperor, who was Ptolemy in Alexandria.